We've recently completed an interview with a remarkable woman, Shirley Crane from Katherine in the Northern Territory. Shirley grew up in far north Queensland among Aboriginal people and has spent quite a bit of her teaching career with Aboriginal people. She's still teaching in a pastoral capacity in Katherine, very young children of Aboriginal descent. She has a great deal to say and many insights, and I recommend each of these videos to you. What we've done is present 4 short videos and then 1 long one. Now the short ones are on aspects of Aboriginal culture, things like humbugging and payback and welcome to country. And as Shirley says, if we can't discuss these things, how can we fix them? And it's very difficult for Aboriginal people to integrate, that is to get a foothold in the modern society, unless they change some of their practices. I recommend these videos from Shirley Crane.
Katherine is a town in dire distress. There's just no other way to describe it. Whatever you're seeing on the news about what's happening in Alice Springs is also happening in Katherine. Katherine is a slightly unusual set of circumstances because it's on the crossroads to everywhere. If you're going from Alice Springs to Darwin, you have to pass through Katherine. You're going from Longreach to Broome, you've got to pass through Katherine. Everyone has to pass through Katherine. So what happens is that if there's a government clampdown in any town, any Aboriginal community, they will usually leave and come to Katherine. We usually have at least 300 to 400 people sleeping on the street here. Some of them go out to the long grass camps, but in the wet weather, they'll move into the town and they'll be sleeping in the post office annexes and the bank annexes and anywhere where there's shelter. So that makes it very difficult, really, for the people in the town to just keep the town functioning. As far as the crime situation in Katherine goes, we have had enormous issues with particularly youth crime here. We have gangs of young people that are going around trashing businesses, robbing the service stations, breaking into people's houses. And there doesn't seem to be any way really for the police or the government or the agencies that are here to actually cope with that. A lot of these young people, I think, are the result of very poor planning, the fact that many of them don't speak very good English, some of them are illiterate because they don't go to school, and they've got to the point of being teenagers and young adults with almost no future in front of them. And I think that's pretty sad, but that's the reality for some of these people. We have always had thousands of grey nomads come through here. In fact, some weekends we could have up to 2,000 of the grey nomads parked in, we have 3 or 4 big caravan parks, and then we've got a couple of properties outside Katherine where they can park free of charge. And if all the areas are filled up here, then the council will open the showgrounds and they can park there. It's nothing for us to have a couple of thousand. But lately we've noticed that they don't stay. They drive through Katherine, they might go and strip the shelves in Woolies, and they keep going. They go and they park somewhere else because Katherine has had such poor publicity that we're starting to lose our, the lifeblood of the town, which is the tourist trade. And that's very difficult for the people to cope with here. And that includes the local Aboriginal people, the Jarwin, because the Jarwin are actually they're quite an affluent tribe, and they're a lot of their business is tourism. You know, they own the boat trips up the Katherine Gorge. They own one of the helicopter rides. You know, if you do helicopter trips, they own some of the cultural tours here. So, and they really work quite hard to maintain that. So the Jawoyn are not the issue here. The Jawoyn actually, I think, get as upset as everybody else about people from other tribal groups coming into town and causing all sorts of issues here. And this is part of the problem with the whole attitude that government seems to have towards the Indigenous people. They want to treat them as a homogenous group, and they're not. A lot of these tribes don't get on. They haven't for the last 50 or 60,000 years, and they don't now. As far as I can see, the only solution to closing the gap is to educate the young ones. If kids get to the point where they're in high school and their literacy level is still back at the level of transition year 1, they are just going to drop out. They have no future here because Australia is an English-speaking country. You have to be literate in English, really, to access the opportunities that are available in this country. Now, there is no end of opportunities available, but you have to be employable. If you can't speak English, you can't tell the time, you can't handle money, how are you ever going to get a job here? Now, a job is really what we use to identify ourselves. And if you're in a position where you have never had a job, you don't really see any future for yourself, you're living on government benefits. And I would have to say that the government benefits, between government benefits and mine royalties, some of the Aboriginal people take in quite a lot of money. And if all they do is gamble it and drink it, what use is it to them really? And this is where there's a tragedy being built into the system. And I have to say that a lot of it is just very poor planning on the parts of governments and agencies. I mostly work with the transition year 1 children. They come in virtually with no English because what they speak is Creole, which is it's like a sort of an Aboriginal lingua franca. But it's not universal either because the Desert Creole, and this is spelled K-R-I-O-L, some people seem to think that it's the equivalent of the American C-R-E-O-L-E, but it's not. It's completely different from that. But the Broome Aboriginal people, the people out at Balga, where I did a couple of years of teaching, the people up here in Katherine and the saltwater people and the Desert Creoles, they're all slightly different. They are a language that a number of tribes can use to communicate with each other. It sort of started out as what they called Aboriginal English, but it's actually developed into a language in its own right. And the Creole languages are now, they're recognised languages in their own right. And they're not recognisable as English, but a lot of the kids will come in speaking Creole, or they'll come in speaking a tribal language. They don't come in speaking English. And you will have a lot of the older people out in the communities don't speak English either. So the families, when they're out in the communities, they speak Creole. And when the kids come in, they actually have to be taught to be literate in English because that's their future. If they can't speak English, they're going to end up like the kids that are running around smashing up businesses now. from what I can see, the only way to close the gap is to educate the children. They are beautiful children when they come into school. You know, they have all the hope in the world. And you gradually see that as they get towards high schooling, if they are not literate in English, that starts disappearing. We have an incredible suicide rate out here amongst particularly young men. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that their role has disappeared to some extent. Out in the communities, they were hunters and gatherers. Well, if you don't have a hunting role, the minute you put a shop in a community, where's the role of the hunter and the gatherer? So the women will always have a role because they bring up the children. The men become almost like a loose end. They don't have a designated role once there's a shop in the community. And for all that we think we're doing the right thing by promoting the shops and so forth and so on out in the communities, are we really? We've basically taken away their purpose for existence. So if they don't become literate in English and they can't get a job, what do they do? Well, we know what they do. They drink and they gamble. And the young ones commit suicide because they can't see any future for themselves. You know, we really need to do something urgently about that. Well, there are several aspects of Aboriginal culture that make it very difficult for that closing the gap to happen. The humbugging is something that really has to go. Now, cultures can change. There's no doubt that cultures can change. And in one sense, the Indigenous people have to step up and do something about changing that cultural aspect, because until it does change, there really isn't much hope of closing that gap. If somebody has a job and they're earning money, and at the end of their fortnight when they get paid, they take their money home and they have 10 or 15 relatives who have been sitting around all week doing nothing with their hands out to take that money off them, and they end up with nothing for themselves, why would they work? And the reality is they won't. You know, we have probably a few thousand potential workers here, but they will not work because they are subject to the humbugging culture. If they get money, other people take it off them. So when the mine royalties come out, they go and they don't come back until every cent is spent. Because if they do bring money back to the community, it's gone. That, you know, they say that when Albert Namatjira, the well-known Aboriginal artist, when he died, he had something like about 600 people humbugging off him. So whatever, you know, his paintings were selling for thousands of dollars, but he ended up with nothing because he had all of these people living off him. Now, this is the reality for any of the young Aboriginal people who are thinking about going out working. If they live in a community where humbugging happens, they just get to the point where they can't see any point in working. Now, we've got farmers here who are importing hundreds of workers from East Timor to pick their mangoes. We would have no mangoes in the shop if it wasn't for the people from East Timor and the Solomon Islands, which is where those groups of workers come from. Now, why do we have 400 people sleeping on the streets in Katherine and just getting drunk and smashing the town up when the farmers are having to import hundreds of workers from East Timor. We love having them here, but there's a big question mark over why the farmers are having to bring so many agricultural workers in when we've got a workforce here that really should be doing something, but they're not, and they won't, because any money they earn is not theirs to keep. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a christening down at there's a restaurant attached to one of the pubs here. Well, you know, we had a lovely afternoon there, but in the pub next door, there are about 50 strapping young people as drunk as skunks. Now, these are people who have probably never worked a day in their lives. They don't work because, you know, money is not theirs to keep. So where do they get the money from to drink in the pub all afternoon? That's taxpayer money because it's coming through Centrelink or it's mine royalties. And the mine royalties are a bit of an issue here because every time we have a mine royalties distribution, the kids get pulled out of school. They have that up, probably up at Larger Manu. There are a couple of points where they do the mine distributions, and the kids will be pulled out of school because they have to turn up in person to collect their money, and every child is worth a couple of $1,000. So they'll take the kids out of school. They go and they collect their money. They might have $40,000, $50,000 cash in hand. They will go and they will spend that. They may not come back for a month or two until they've spent it. And then, you know, what is that money really achieving? They need to be educated in how money works because money is what makes the world go round. You cannot manage if you don't know how to work with money. And, you know, I've had old people who come up and they want me to get money from the hole in the wall for them. They call the ATMs the hole in the wall. Well, in Katherine now, we don't have any functioning ATMs because they were all smashed by the gangs last week. So the ANZ Bank has had to move its ATM inside. So you can only get money out of the ATM in banking hours because the one outside's been smashed so often that they haven't even bothered to fix it. And the ATM at the Commonwealth Bank, well, that was a bit of a disaster because there were groups of people who would hang around anybody taking money out of that ATM, and they'd follow them down the street, mug them and take their money. The other thing that I think really needs to go is the payback, because if a person does something to an Indigenous person, there's payback. And this payback goes on between these tribes. I mean, if you think, you know, the Campbells and the McDonalds in Scotland are a bit over the top for having kept Glencoe going for the last 300 or 400 years, they've never seen anything yet because some of these tribes can keep it going for 1,000 years. You know, it's one payback after another payback after another payback. And our governments are not really geared to cope with that. You know, we talk about closing the gap, but we don't even know what the gap is. You know, when you're talking about humbugging, how do you convince Aboriginal people that they need to go out and get a job if they're going to have all their money taken off them by the humbuggers? So that's one cultural aspect that is either going to have to go, or somewhere along the line, the governments are going to have to wise up and start dealing with this. The payback. Now, we had two tribes here, one from Mataranka and one from Timber Creek, fighting it out on the street here. Well, you could say fighting it out, but it's more like a choreographed performance, because they line up along the street and they shake spears at each other. They throw rocks. Now, that might do some damage. Quite often passing cars here get rocks hurled at them. But the police can't do anything. There might be 50 or 60 Aboriginal people doing this. How are 4 police going to handle that? You know, when that happened, well, they were busy dealing with a couple of domestic violence cases, so they didn't get here for a couple of hours, and this yelling and screaming and swearing and so on went on nearly all night. And then all of a sudden, they all just turned around and walked away. So whether or not there's a sort of a set of rules, but we don't know. We don't know what actually governs these payback things. You know, it's a lot of it is just such a total misunderstanding of how Aboriginal culture works. The death of that young fellow down at Yuandamu, and when the coroner went down there, and they've got a little group of people there saying, oh, you know, they have to get this policeman and they have to spare him because this is part of payback culture. And the coroner's there and not saying anything about that. You sort of wonder, how does the government deal with that kind of situation? I mean, this is, you know, 2024. We should actually be moving a bit beyond all that stuff, and we also shouldn't be condoning it. Well, there's a gang of girls that have been going around basically mugging old ladies at the shopping centre. They've been pretty much destroying the service stations here. Now, these girls are aged probably between about 9 and 15. Now, there was that video showed the young staff member in that service station fled. The minute this group of girls came in, she just ran straight out the door. She wasn't hanging around. And you can't blame her, because they've attacked staff members in other service stations. We don't know exactly who these girls are. They don't seem to be local. Whether there are any local girls mixed up with them, we don't know. And they don't seem to have been picked up by the police. But they've done over 2 or 3 service stations in the last few days. They broke into a service station the other night, and they actually had one of a fairly elderly woman, she's in her 60s, I think. They had her down on the floor, spraying her with the foam from a fire extinguisher, and she's a chronic asthmatic. She ended up in hospital. At the same time as that was happening, there was a group of boys doing over one of the other service stations. They smashed every piece of glass in that place, all the windows, all the doors, the glass-fronted refrigerators. The whole place was just smashed up. And, you know, around about the same time, there were just down the road from my house, there was a break-in about 2:30 in the morning. They threatened the homeowner and his wife. They threatened them with knives, and they took their car keys, stole their car. Then they took the car down and they used that to steal a motorcycle from the motorcycle place. They smashed up the front of the motorcycle place. Almost every shop in town now has steel bollards in front of it and has those big metal roller doors. The place looks like it's under siege, and basically it is. But, you know, as far as the police are concerned, there's not that much they can do about it, because we normally at night time only have, say, 2 patrols on. Now, we are averaging 60 domestic violence case call-outs per week. And we're on top of that. there will be between 60 and 90 property damage or break-ins per week. We just have one little police station. How on earth can they deal with that? So if we have 2 patrols on at night time and you have to have 2 police go to each of the cases, the first 2 cases that call in are going to get the attention. What happens to the others? Well, nothing happens because there's nobody to go and answer the call. I think the police here do quite a remarkable job, considering that there's not enough of them. They don't get the backup from their own people. You know, their administration, I think, is pretty poor. That Zach Rolfe case probably caused maybe 250 resignations from the Northern Territory Police. Police just left and went to other states because they knew that they were not going to get any backup here. So it's a very, very difficult position. You know, there's one young policewoman that I know here. She loves going out bush. She'd rather be out in a bush community, and there are certain communities where the police are very well thought of, you know, and basically that they are far more comfortable out there than they are actually in the town of Katherine. Katherine's not safe for the police. As far as Katherine is concerned, we need interim accommodation for hospital patients. Now, a lot of the people sleeping on the streets, they're people who come in for medical treatment because the Katherine Hospital treats virtually the whole of Arnhem Land. It's right down, you know, to past Mataranka, right up almost to Darwin. The Katherine Hospital treats an enormous area. So we have people coming in from everywhere. And a lot of the issue here is, where do they go when they get discharged from hospital? Some of them are not well enough to go back to their communities. They may not have relatives in the town, but if they do have relatives in the town, I mean, those relatives can end up with 20 people in their house and no sort of, you know, capacity to properly feed them, properly house them. This is why the kids end up out on the street half the time, because all of the beds in the house will be occupied and the kids have got nowhere to sleep. They either sleep on the floor or they sleep out in the yard. So for some of those kids, the street's a safer place than being at home. And that's, you know, that's the reality that we're dealing with here. So we need interim accommodation for medical cases. We probably need homeless accommodation. We do have quite a few of our own genuine homeless here. I mean, there's a man that some friends and I, if we see him around, we buy him breakfast, or we might give him some money for his smokes, or, you know, to sort of help him out. And it was very telling that when the government shut down a lot of the facilities down in Alice Springs, and there was rioting going on up in Wadeye, that they'd stolen a number of crossbows. They killed one young man up there. They actually trashed about 300 houses and put about 500 people out on the street. And a lot of that 500 people came down to Katherine. So we had a lot of trouble going on our streets. And this poor homeless man, we hadn't seen him around for about 7 or 8 weeks, and we were getting a bit worried about him. But we saw him one day down at the coffee club. We bought him breakfast and asked him where he'd been, and he just said, oh, he said that Alice Springs and Wadeye mob, he said they were in town, so he said I had to go. He said it's not safe. It's not safe. So this is our local homeless had to move out because all of these other people were moving in. I mean, yesterday morning somebody filmed a bunch of them walking out without paying for their groceries, but nobody can stop them. A lot of the shops here actually operate behind locked doors because the staff are not safe. You know, when that young fellow who worked in the grog shop up in Darwin was knifed and killed because he tried to stop somebody walking out with a heap of grog. The whole attitude then was that if there's Aboriginal thieves in the shop, you have to just let them go because you don't know if they're going to pull a knife on you. We've had a gang of girls that have been going around the shopping centre here, and they have threatened people with knives, including the security guards and some of the shopkeepers. And because they're young and they don't have any sense of consequences, if they've got a knife, they'll use it. Somewhere along the line, something has to happen about reconnecting these young people with their culture. Now, if we do not have a place where they can go to be reconnected, then they'll end up in limbo land. They're not really part of the mainstream Australian population, but they're not part of their own Indigenous culture either. Now, the one Aboriginal community where I was working, and I loved going there because it's an absolutely wonderful community, is Ramingining. Now, Ramingining is culturally very strong, but that's a community that has made a decision to sort itself out. So what would happen is that the school was very well attended because there was a group of elders that they used to wear a yellow shirt, and they were known as the yellow shirts, who conducted a walking school bus. Now, as a teacher, if you were in that school and the kids were not at school, you just gave their names. Any child who was absent without a reasonable excuse, like being out of the community or being sick, you gave that name to one of the elders. The elders would then go round to that house, and if the kid wasn't out of bed, he got out of bed. He would be at school because he had to walk to school with the walking school bus. Now, the kids didn't particularly like, it was a bit of a shame job to walk to school with the walking school bus. So the kids either tended to come to school or they'd bolt. If they bolted, then they were not dealing with the school, they were dealing with a committee of elders, because the elders would be at the house, they would interview the family to find out why this kid wasn't at school, and then usually the family would sort the problem out and the kid would be at school. So the attendance at Ramingining was actually pretty good. As a teacher, you didn't have too many issues in the classroom because there were two elders would stay in the school all day, one male, one female. They used to stay over in the staff room. If you had any issues in your classroom, all you had to do was say to the kid, do you want to go and talk to one of the yellow shirts? No, they did not want to go and talk to the yellow shirts. Culturally, that community was also very strong. So they'd made a decision to ensure that their children were properly educated in English, but they also made sure that they maintained their own culture. And I think that made a big difference to those kids. You didn't have the issues with those children that you see with a lot of the children here, because they weren't in limbo land. They knew exactly where they were. They knew who they were. Culturally, they were very strong within their Indigenous culture, but they also knew that they needed to learn to speak English. And it makes a difference. The whole attitude of the families makes such a difference. That was a lovely community to work in. And an absolute model, I think, for Indigenous communities. Some of those children have actually made it through into high school, gone away to boarding school. I'm not sure exactly where they've all ended up, but we don't get people from Ramingining down here in Katherine. Yeah. Well, defining an Aboriginal person, when that actually happened, when the sit-down money and all of these programs sort of came into existence, the Aboriginal population in Australia doubled within 12 months. Because there were all of these people who just came out of the woodwork and suddenly started identifying themselves as Indigenous. Now, some of them may have been, and they'd been hiding it, because in the past, that was what happened. You know, if you had Indigenous background, you didn't make a big fuss about it because it didn't provide you with any advantage, and it may have been a disadvantage. But once all these programs started coming in, there's job training programs, there's Austudy, there's, you know, various grants and so on that went specifically to Indigenous people. And on every government form out here, the first question is, do you identify as Indigenous? And if you do, you will be given preference in employment. So it is made very clear on every job application that Indigenous people will be given preference for employment. So I think a lot of people started identifying as Indigenous simply because of that they would then move up the list of possible employees if they were applying for a job. But when you look at some of the people who are now identifying as Indigenous, I mean, they're white-skinned people. Some of them are fair-haired, some of them are blue-eyed, some of them, I'm sure, have not been brought up within the Indigenous culture. If they haven't been brought up in the Indigenous culture, they don't speak Creole or another traditional Aboriginal language. Some of them don't even know what tribe their Indigenous ancestor was supposed to be associated with. How can they identify themselves as Indigenous? We actually need a clear definition, because there are Indigenous people who desperately need help, but we have maybe a quarter to a half of the so-called identifying Indigenous population who shouldn't be classified that way. So if we're spending $33 billion a year, and that's the rough estimate of what's being spent annually now on Indigenous programs, that's $15 billion that's going in the wrong direction. You know, we have around 30 non-government organisations and government organisations here that are supposed to be providing services for the Indigenous people. But nobody really knows what they do. So, and we're not seeing the benefit of all of that money that is going into so-called Indigenous programs. So somewhere along the line, there has to be accountability, there has to be auditing, and whatever services are supposed to be provided must actually be provided. We don't know if they are being provided. It was very telling that when, the businesses here have been smashed up, people just walking down the street with claw hammers, smashing all their glass windows and breaking into the businesses, stealing stock. When all of that was really at its very worst, the non-government organisations wouldn't sign a local petition. Now, the business owners got together, they had a meeting, they organised a petition to go up to Parliament to request a curfew and additional police in the town and some sort of monitoring of just what is being offered here. most of the non-government organisations wouldn't sign it, even though their properties were being trashed along with everybody else's. Partly because I think they're afraid that if they were ever audited or any close monitoring actually happened, their funding is going to be affected. I mean, if we've got 3 organisations that are offering preschool, preparation for kids, why do we have 3 of them? They overlap each other. They're all being funded. They're all providing much the same kind of service, but they don't work together. And we've got this situation with a lot of the Aboriginal services that we may have 2 or 3 that are duplicating a particular service to the Aboriginal people, but they're not working together, and we don't really know what they're doing. We badly need something that is 24 hours a day so that if kids are picked up off the street at night time, they've got somewhere safe to go. But most of these organisations, they just close at 4:30, 5 o'clock. They work office hours. Now, office hours is not when the problem is. The problem's at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. The Aboriginal people here are considerably better off with the facilities that they do have available to them than the non-Indigenous people. There's an Aboriginal clinic here that usually has a minimum of about 9 GPs. It has a full-time dentist, it has a full-time pharmacist, a full-time psychologist. Well, then the non-Indigenous don't have any of that. In fact, at one stage, we went for months with no GP clinic here at all. So the non-Indigenous population, which is about 8,000 people, had no medical service apart from the hospital. And if you went down to the Indigenous clinic, I'm sorry, they didn't treat anybody other than, if you did not identify as Indigenous, you could collapse on their doorstep and they would not treat you. You would just get sent straight up to the hospital. Very awkward position in that if Indigenous people are brought in, they will usually be seen prior to any non-Indigenous because they're usually in a situation where they have to be treated as an emergency. If their injuries are the result of a fight or drunkenness, then they have to be treated as an urgent case. So if you go up to the hospital because there's no doctor available, you will sit there for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours before you can actually see a doctor. It's, for all that people have the idea that the Indigenous are really badly off, in some cases, they're a lot better off than the non-Indigenous in communities like ours. I think I explained that Welcome to Country, as far as I can see, it has absolutely no significance to the Aboriginal people at all. Any of the Aboriginal people that I've spoken to about it, they don't see it as part of their cultural experience. The background of that Welcome to Country ceremony is actually, it goes back to sort of the mid-1970s when Ernie Dingo and Richard Wally, who are 2 Aboriginal comedians, they had invited a group of dancers. I think they were from either Cook Island or New Zealand, Maoris, and they wouldn't dance unless they got a ceremonial welcome. Now, most of the Aboriginal people don't have a ceremonial welcome. I mean, I've lived with Aboriginal people all my life, and I had never seen anything like a Welcome to Country ceremony. I've seen corroborees, I've seen all sorts of, ceremonial stuff from the Aboriginal people, but never a Welcome to Country. So where these 2 people, Ernie Dingo and Richard Wally got that from, goodness knows. But when these dancers wouldn't dance without having a ceremonial welcome, they came back with a ceremony. Now, who knows where they got it from? If it was actually an Aboriginal ceremony, it would have been very local, because none of the tribes have the same culture, none of them have the same language. You know, if it came from an Aboriginal tribe somewhere around Perth, it would have no relevance to a tribe up here or a tribe in Queensland, because they all do things very differently. The cultures within the tribes are very different. You know, it's not one great big homogenous group of Aboriginal people. They are individual tribes with their own customs and their own languages. And basically, a lot of them have been fighting each other for about the last 60,000 years, and they still are. So where did it come from? Maybe the thing to do is to ask Ernie Dingo where he got it from. But if you've got people in Sydney who are concerned about the date of Australia Day and wanting to call it Invasion Day or whatever other agenda they have, but you've got people in communities out here who need decent housing, they need clean drinking water, they need to have their garbage trucks repaired. I mean, one of the communities, you know, when I was teaching out at Balgo, the garbage truck out there wasn't repaired for 6 months. And then they wonder why the community is a mess, because people haven't got anywhere to put their garbage. So if you can't get tradespeople to go out to the communities and you haven't got clean drinking water, where should you be spending your money? Should you be spending it on that rather than worrying about whether we call Australia Day Invasion Day or putting a flag on top of Sydney Harbour? I'm sorry, I just see that there are such different priorities. And as far as, you know, the whole Australia Day debate, I just find that a bit ridiculous. You know, changing the date of Australia Day is not going to make one blind bit of difference to the quality of life of people out in a remote community. And one of the biggest problems, of course, is that the Indigenous themselves are not a united group. So you'll have people, you know, who are making pronouncements that might suit one group of Aboriginal people, but it's to the detriment of others. And I think that's one of the reasons why that referendum failed. A lot of the Aboriginal people out here voted against it because I think they could see, you know, a number of my Aboriginal friends voted against it because they didn't trust it. They could see that a lot of the spokespeople were urban Indigenous or, you know, pretty white-skinned Indigenous, some of them. And they sort of felt that they'd have a totally different agenda to the people out here who are really the genuine article, and a lot of them who really need things like clean drinking water. So if the agendas are going to be governed by the people who are urbanised, people's living in the city, what benefit is that going to be to the people out in the remote communities? They have totally different agendas. And I think that a lot of the Aboriginal people out here could just see that it wasn't going to benefit them at all, and they voted against it. Of course, a lot of the voting here, the voting for that referendum was a disaster out here. The mobile ballots flew into communities quite often without any warning. The people hadn't been briefed about the fact that a referendum was happening. Some of them didn't even know it was happening, didn't know anything about it. The plane took out one yes person, presumably to collect yes votes, but the no side didn't have anybody going out with the plane. It would be in the community for a couple of hours. Now, if that community was engaged in sorry business, if they'd had somebody die and they had a sorry camp going on, there's nobody there to vote. But they advised the communities that when the mobile ballot came in, it would be there for a set period of time, maybe 2 or 3 hours. If they didn't come to vote, then they didn't get a vote. So some of the communities they went into, it might be half a dozen people there to vote. You know, people in the admin office who had to stay there. And this is what happened out at Balgo, the federal election out there. We had a sorry camp going on, and the number of people in town was sort of limited to the teachers who were basically, you know, we were non-Indigenous, a couple of the medical staff, the fellow who ran the admin office, and the lady who ran the art gallery. So we were the people who voted in the federal election because everybody else was at the sorry camp. Now, if a government doesn't have the good sense to actually find out if that's a convenient time to go out and get a vote, then I'm sorry, they deserve the result they got. Somewhere along the line, they have to start talking to these people, you know, talk to them and find out what's going on in their communities. And when they come to build their houses and, you know, they're making pronouncements about what these people are going to get, which may not be what they need. So they could be spending billions of dollars on something that the Aboriginal people won't use. The government is so sensitive about the whole Indigenous issue that it won't move in and do anything about it. You know, we've got kids who don't come to school for days, for weeks. But if you were a non-Indigenous person and you didn't send your kid to school, what would happen to you? Yeah, I think you'd be in a bit of trouble, wouldn't you? So how is it that these Indigenous kids who so desperately need to learn to speak English, to become literate, and it's their whole future, and it's, you know, it may be the thing that stops them from going out and committing suicide because they've got no purpose in life later on. How is it that these kids can be just not required to go to school? You have to be able to do something to help them rather than just constantly back off. Because what a lot of people don't understand is that the Indigenous can manipulate situations to suit themselves. They can tell lies, they can do all of the things that the rest of us do. But governments have got to stop assuming that everything that comes out of an Indigenous person's mouth is gospel truth. And they've got to start looking at, you know, where do we go from here? If we can't actually sit down and talk about these things, the biggest problem that we have, I think, are the do-gooders, the so-called the woke mob. I'm not quite sure exactly what the definition of a woke mob is, but there seem to be so many people who it doesn't matter what a government tries to do or what an organisation tries to do, there's always somebody who steps in there and says, no, you can't do that because it's racist. And the minute anybody tries to discuss anything to do with the Indigenous, it's shut down because it's racist. Now, we've got to get past that because a lot of the issues are related to the Indigenous. If you can't discuss it, how can you fix it?